They say the most important days of your life are the ones you never forget. But they don't tell you that sometimes, you remember them for all the wrong reasons. I sat there, surrounded by a sea of bright blue graduation gowns, the nervous energy in the massive auditorium humming like an electric current. Around me, my classmates were laughing, adjusting their caps, and waving frantically at the crowded stands. Everyone was looking for their people. Everyone was scanning the rows of faces, searching for that one proud smile that made years of sleepless nights entirely worth it. I was doing the exact same thing. My eyes swept across row 4, section B. That was where my family was supposed to be. I had paid for the premium guest tickets myself, using the absolute last bit of cash from my third part-time job. I remember counting out the crumpled dollar bills at the university box office, a massive grin on my face, thinking about how proud my dad would be to sit right at the front. But row 4, section B, was entirely empty. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Traffic must have been terrible near the campus. Finding parking on graduation day is notoriously a nightmare. Maybe they got lost looking for the specific gate. I checked my phone under the wide sleeve of my gown. No missed calls. No unread text messages. The screen was completely blank, staring back at me like a cold glass eye. The guy sitting right next to me bumped his shoulder against mine, pointing toward the upper deck where his entire extended family had unfurled a massive, handwritten banner with his name on it. He was beaming, his eyes watering up with pure joy. I forced a tight smile, nodding along to his happiness while a freezing cold weight settled deep into the pit of my stomach. They will show up, I kept telling myself. Dad promised. He explicitly said he wouldn't miss this for the world. The ceremony began. The heavy, booming chords of the traditional processional music echoed through the rafters, vibrating right through my chest. One by one, names were called. Students walked up the wooden steps, shook the dean's hand, grabbed their diplomas, and the crowd would erupt into cheers, air horns, and whistles. Every single time a new name echoed over the speakers, my heart took a violent leap. And every single time, I looked back at row 4. Still empty. By the time my name was called, a strange, numb sensation had taken over my hands and feet. I stood up automatically, moving like a poorly programmed robot. I walked up those steps, the bright stage lights blinding my eyes, completely washing out the crowd. I received the leather-bound folder. I shook the hand of a faculty member whose name I couldn't even remember. I smiled for the official university camera. But inside, I was entirely hollow. When I walked down the steps on the opposite side of the stage, I didn't feel like a college graduate with a bright, shining future. I felt like a discarded piece of trash. I sat back down in my seat, staring at the diploma in my lap. I had spent 4 years starving, skipping meals, studying until my eyes bled, and working late-night shifts at a dingy local diner just to reach this finish line. I had built a future entirely out of nothing, with absolutely zero financial help from my family. All I had asked for, the only single thing I wanted in return, was for them to sit in those seats and witness it. When the ceremony finally concluded, the auditorium erupted. Hundreds of mortarboard caps flew into the air like a flock of black birds. Confetti rained down from the ceiling, catching the light as it drifted lazily to the floor. Tears, hugs, laughter. It was a chaotic explosion of human celebration. I stood completely still in the middle of the madness, feeling like a ghost. I slowly walked out of the heavy glass doors of the auditorium, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sun. Families were gathered everywhere on the manicured lawns, taking photos, laughing, and handing out bouquets of flowers. I took my phone out of my pocket again. Still nothing. I walked over to a quiet, shaded bench near the edge of the campus, far away from the celebration. I sat down, pulled off my cap, and buried my face in my hands. The tears didn't come immediately. First came the numbness, then a deep, burning sense of humiliation. That was when my phone finally vibrated in my palm. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled it up instantly, hoping against hope for an explanation. A car accident, a sudden illness. At that moment, I would have preferred any disaster over the alternative. It was a text from my dad. I opened it, my thumb trembling slightly. There was no apology. There was no mention of the graduation ceremony whatsoever. The message read that he had left my set of spare house keys on the kitchen counter, and to make sure I locked up the apartment before heading back to my place tonight. He said they had to go out of town for my brother's weekend tournament, and finish with a casual good luck today. I stared at the glowing words until they blurred together into a meaningless smudge. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't gotten stuck in traffic. They hadn't run into a sudden, unforeseen emergency. They had deliberately chosen to drive 3 hours in the opposite direction to watch my younger brother, Leo, play in a casual, weekend amateur baseball tournament. A tournament he played in literally every single weekend of the year. My college graduation, the milestone event that marked me as the very first person in our family line to ever earn a higher degree, wasn't even an afterthought. It was a chore they simply decided to skip. I leaned back against the hard wooden slats of the bench, staring up at the blue sky through the green leaves of the oak tree. The deep, aching sadness inside me slowly began to shift, hardening into something completely different. It was a cold, quiet anger. It was the realization that no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would always be the invisible child. I stood up, threw my graduation cap into my backpack, and walked toward the train station alone. I didn't know it yet, but that empty seat in row 4 was the exact moment my old life ended. And it was the catalyst for a massive storm that would come knocking on my door exactly 3 years later. To understand why that empty seat cut so deep, you have to understand the dynamic of the family I grew up in. For as long as I can remember, I was the outsider. I was the kid who lived in the background of someone else's highlight reel. My father, Richard, was a man who valued one thing above all else: status that he could easily show off to his friends. He wanted loud successes, trophies he could display on the mantle, and stories he could boast about over beers at the local country club. And my younger brother, Leo, gave him exactly that. Leo was a natural athlete. He was tall, outgoing, naturally charismatic, and completely effortless in everything he did. From the moment he picked up a baseball bat in Little League, my dad's entire universe revolved completely around him. Every weekend was dedicated to Leo's travel teams. Every spare dollar in the household budget was funneled into top-tier coaching, expensive equipment, and cross-country sports trips. Richard didn't just support Leo, he lived vicariously through him. And then there was me. I was the quiet, bookish kid who preferred reading in the corner over throwing a football in the backyard. I excelled at academics, but in our house, straight A's on a report card didn't get you a celebration. It got you a distracted nod and a quick shift in conversation back to Leo's latest home run. I vividly remember my 16th birthday. For months, I had been talking about a specific weekend computer science seminar being hosted at a community college just an hour away. It was a massive opportunity for high school students, and I had worked hard to get accepted into the program. The seminar fell exactly on my birthday weekend. On Friday night, I sat at the dinner table, nervously bringing it up, asking if my dad could drive me since the bus line didn't run that early on Saturdays. Richard didn't even look up from his phone, where he was scrolling through a sports equipment website. He told me he couldn't do it because Leo had an early morning batting practice session with his private coach all the way across town, and that I'd have to figure something else out. When I told him it was my birthday, my mother offered a sympathetic but ultimately useless sigh, saying we could celebrate on Sunday night when they got back, because Leo's big game was this weekend, and my father really needed to be there to film it for the scouts. That was the structural reality of my entire childhood. My needs, my milestones, and my existence were always perfectly negotiable. Leo's desires were absolute law. When it came time for college, the divide became a yawning chasm. One evening during my senior year of high school, we sat down to discuss my future. I had been accepted into a fantastic university, but the tuition was steep. Richard took a slow sip of his coffee and delivered the news with the casual indifference of a bank teller denying a routine loan request, telling me they just didn't have the funds to assist me. He said college was a luxury, that I was smart enough to figure out scholarships or loans, and that they had to keep their focus on Leo's future because his travel team fees were going up. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just looked at my parents and realized, with absolute clarity, that I was entirely on my own. So I did exactly what Richard said. I figured it out. I took out federal student loans. I packed my bags and moved into a tiny, cramped studio apartment that smelled permanently of old radiator steam and damp carpets. I worked 3 separate jobs while carrying a full-time course load. I washed dishes at a local diner from early morning, attended lectures, worked at the university library until night, and then spent my late hours coding until my eyes watered. During those 4 grueling years, my family rarely called. When they did, the conversations were entirely one-sided, focused completely on Leo's pitching stats and the major college offers he was looking at. When I would mention making the dean's list or getting a perfect GPA, Richard would dismiss it as great, call me a smart kid, and say he had to run because Leo's coach was calling on the other line. I kept telling myself that if I just achieved enough, if I worked hard enough to stand on a grand stage with a degree in my hand, they would finally look at me. But as I sat on that train heading back to my empty apartment on graduation day, the illusion finally shattered for good. They would never see me. Because to them, I wasn't a son or a brother. I was just a ghost who lived in their house until he was old enough to leave. I pulled out my phone, went into my contacts, and silently deleted the family group chat. I decided that from that day forward, I would build my life as if I were a true orphan. I would become my own biggest supporter. And for the next 3 years, that strategy worked beautifully. There is a strange, fierce kind of freedom that comes with realizing nobody is coming to save you. Once you accept that you are entirely alone, the fear of failure completely evaporates. After graduation, I buried myself completely into my work. I landed an entry-level software engineering role at a fast-growing tech startup in the city. The pay was modest at first, but the potential was massive. While my old college peers went out to bars on Friday nights to celebrate their new corporate salaries, I went right back to my tiny apartment, pulled up my laptop, and kept working. I wasn't just doing my day job. I was building my own software platform on the side. It was a specialized data management tool designed for small e-commerce businesses. A niche I had noticed was desperately underserved during my time working part-time tech support in college. My daily routine was brutal. I would wake up at dawn, grind through a 10-hour day at the startup, eat a quick meal, and then spend hours building my own code. My apartment became a cave of glowing monitors, empty coffee mugs, and whiteboards covered in intricate, complex diagrams. Every single time my energy flagged, every time I felt like giving up and just crawling into bed, my mind would automatically drift back to row 4, section B. I would see those empty, red velvet seats in the university auditorium. That bitter memory wasn't a weight dragging me down anymore. It had transformed into pure rocket fuel. 14 months into this grueling routine, my side project finally launched. I called it Nexus Flow. At first, it was just a few small clients, local online boutiques paying a tiny monthly subscription fee. But the software worked beautifully. It saved them hours of manual labor, and word of mouth began to spread like wildfire in e-commerce forums. Suddenly, my little side hustle wasn't so little anymore. The monthly recurring revenue began to double, then triple. Within 2 years of graduation, Nexus Flow was making more money in a single week than my day job paid me in an entire month. I took a deep breath, handed in my 2 weeks' notice at the startup, and went entirely independent. By the age of 25, my life had completely transformed. I moved out of that dingy, damp studio apartment and into a stunning, sun-drenched loft downtown. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to look at the prices on a menu. I didn't have to worry about my bank account dropping into the negative before payday. Despite the sudden influx of wealth, I didn't become reckless. I didn't go out and buy a flashy sports car or expensive designer clothes to show off. The lessons of my childhood had left me with a deep, psychological need for security. I saved aggressively. I invested wisely. I managed to build a completely separate, untouchable high-yield savings account that held exactly $85,000. To me, that specific number wasn't just money. It was my shield against the world. It was the absolute guarantee that I would never, ever have to beg anyone for help again. It was my ultimate freedom fund. During these 3 years of intense growth, my relationship with my family was practically non-existent. I would receive a generic birthday text from my mother once a year, to which I would respond with a polite, brief thank you. Richard would occasionally send a mass text blast bragging about Leo's college baseball stats, which I completely ignored. They never asked how my business was doing. They never asked where I was living. They assumed I was still a struggling junior programmer, barely scraping by in some dark corner of the city. And I was completely fine with that. I preferred it that way. I had successfully built a beautiful, peaceful life on top of the ruins of my childhood. I had found great friends, a solid routine, and a profound sense of self-worth that didn't depend on Richard's validation. But peace in a story like this is always just the calm before the storm. It was a chilly Tuesday evening in November. I was sitting on my plush sofa, a warm mug of tea in my hands, reviewing the quarterly revenue charts for Nexus Flow on my tablet. The numbers were fantastic, and I was feeling a deep, rare sense of absolute contentment. Then my phone rang. I glanced down at the screen, expecting a client or a customer service escalation. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen call me directly in over 3 years. It was Richard. My thumb hovered over the decline button. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to shut it down, to protect my peace, to let the ghost stay in the past. But curiosity, mixed with a strange, lingering remnant of childhood habit, won out. I swiped to answer, and placed the phone to my ear. I said hello, and Richard's voice boomed through the receiver, telling me how good it was to hear my voice. But something was completely off. The usual arrogant, booming confidence was entirely gone. Instead, his voice carried a frantic, high-pitched energy that immediately made my guard go up. I kept my tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of emotion, and noted that it had been a while. Richard agreed, stammering that things had been absolutely crazy, but then added that he was actually in my area. He said he was sitting in the coffee shop right down the block from my old apartment building and begged me to come down because they really needed to talk, calling it incredibly urgent. I leaned back against my sofa, looking around my gorgeous, spacious loft, a place he didn't even know existed because he still thought I lived in a slum. When I told him I didn't live there anymore, he told me to name a spot wherever I was, pleading that he needed to see me right now. The desperation in his voice was thick, almost suffocating. For the first time in my entire life, Richard wasn't calling to brag. He was calling because he was drowning. 10 minutes later, I walked into a quiet, dimly lit diner a few blocks from my apartment. I chose a booth in the very back, away from the windows, wanting to keep this meeting as clinical and private as possible. I sat down and waited. A moment later, the front door jingled, and Richard walked in. I barely recognized him. The man who had always carried himself with an insufferable, bulletproof arrogance looked utterly defeated. His hair was messy, his jacket was slightly wrinkled, and deep, dark purple bags hung heavy under his eyes. He scanned the room frantically until his gaze locked onto me. He practically stumbled over to the booth, sliding into the opposite seat with a heavy, exhausted groan. He thanked me for coming, rubbing his face with trembling hands, and said he didn't know who else to turn to. I asked what was going on, keeping my arms crossed, my voice matching the cold professional tone I used with difficult business clients. Richard took a deep, ragged breath and said it was Leo, that everything was a complete disaster. Internal alarms immediately went off in my head. Of course. Within 2 minutes of our first conversation in 3 years, the topic was already completely centered on Leo. I suppressed a bitter sigh and asked what happened to his brother. Richard explained that Leo had a major shoulder injury during the final game of the Scout Showcase last month, a complete tear of the rotator cuff. He said Leo went through a massive surgery, but the doctors said his throwing arm would never be the same. His velocity was gone, the Major League Scouts entirely walked away, and his private sports academy scholarship had been revoked. I sat in silence, processing the information. On a human level, I felt a brief flash of sympathy for Leo. His entire identity had been wrapped up in sports, much like my dad's. But I also knew the cold reality of the situation, so I calmly noted that it was unfortunate, but asked what it had to do with him calling me tonight. Richard leaned forward across the table, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on mine with terrifying intensity. He told me I didn't understand the financial reality, admitting that to keep Leo in that elite academy, to pay for his private trainers, his travel teams, and that specialized medical surgery, he had taken out massive secondary loans, maxed out every credit card, and even leveraged the equity on their house. He stopped, swallowing hard, a look of profound, naked shame crossing his face as he revealed that the surgery bills had just hit. The collection agency was threatening to clear out their remaining accounts, and the bank was looking at pre-foreclosure on the house. He said they were completely underwater, and that if he didn't get a cash injection immediately, they would lose absolutely everything. I stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle instantly clicking together in my mind. He hadn't called me because he missed his son. He hadn't called me because he felt guilty about the years of neglect. He had called me because he viewed me as a financial emergency valve. I asked him how much he needed, my voice deadly quiet. Richard licked his dry lips, looking down at his hands before revealing that he needed $8,000 right now, by Friday morning, to halt the bank actions and pay the minimum medical block. I almost laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man sitting across from me was almost breathtaking. I repeated the number slowly, letting it hang heavy in the air between us. Richard pleaded, his hands reaching across the table, acknowledging that he knew things had been tight for me in the past, but saying that since I was a smart tech guy, I must have saved up something from my jobs. He admitted it was a massive ask, practically everything I probably had in my savings, but then added that I was his son, and that family helps family when the chips are down. Family helps family. Those 3 words echoed through my brain like a cruel joke. I flashed back to my 16th birthday when I was told to figure something else out. I flashed back to the college tuition discussion when I was told the family investment needed to go to Leo. And most vividly of all, I flashed back to row 4, section B, and those empty, quiet red velvet seats. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars funding Leo's sports fantasy, throwing money they didn't even have into a high-stakes gamble for social status, completely starving me of even basic emotional support. And now that their gamble had failed, now that the house of cards was collapsing, they expected me to hand over my hard-earned security to bail them out. They wanted my life savings, or at least, what they thought was my entire life savings based on their completely outdated assumptions about my life. I looked at Richard. I saw the desperation in his face, but I also saw the deep, underlying entitlement. He still didn't see me. He saw an ATM with his last name on it. I leaned forward, my voice cool and perfectly steady, and asked him where he was on June 14th, 3 years ago. Richard blinked, completely caught off guard by the question, gesturing frantically and asking why that mattered right now when they were talking about their house and his brother's future. I told him that it was my graduation day, and the words cut through the air like a razor blade. Richard froze, the color instantly draining from his face, leaving him looking even more sickly under the dim diner lights. I continued, my voice entirely devoid of anger, reminding him that he skipped my college graduation to drive 3 hours in the opposite direction for a casual weekend tournament, without even calling, just sending a text telling me to lock up his apartment. Richard stammered that it was a mistake and that he was sorry, but argued that it was years ago and they were just caught up in the scout schedule. I raised a single hand to cut him off, telling him that he wasn't under pressure. He just didn't care. I reminded him that he made a conscious decision that my highest achievement wasn't worth a single afternoon of his time, telling me to figure it out on my own. So I did. I stood up from the booth, pulling a $20 bill out of my wallet and dropping it onto the table to cover the untouched coffees. I told him I needed some time to think about it, and that I would give him my answer tomorrow night, instructing him to come to the address on the small business card I slid across the table at 8 o'clock. It didn't have my home address, It had the address of my sleek, corporate office downtown. Richard looked at the card, then up at me, a flicker of desperate hope returning to his eyes as he thanked me and begged me to think about the family. I turned around and walked out of the diner, without saying another word. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the old hurt. I felt a cold, brilliant clarity. The trap was set, and they had walked right into it. The next morning, I woke up feeling an incredible sense of focus. I didn't head straight to my computer to check client code. Instead, I sat at my kitchen island with a clean notebook and a pen, mapping out exactly how the next 24 hours would unfold. I knew one thing for certain. I was absolutely not going to hand over $8,000 to fund Richard's reckless financial bleeding. If I simply gave him the cash, it would be swallowed up instantly by his debts, and within 3 months he would be right back at my door begging for more. It wouldn't teach him a lesson, and it wouldn't fix the underlying rot in our family dynamic. But I also knew that flat-out refusing him over text message was too simple. It didn't provide closure. It didn't balance the scales of justice that had been heavily tipped against me for over 2 decades. I wanted them to completely see the reality of what they had thrown away. I wanted them to realize the exact cost of their betrayal. I picked up my phone and called my legal counsel, a brilliant corporate attorney named Sarah who handled all of NexusFlow's contract structures, telling her I needed a highly specific, legally binding contract drawn up by this afternoon for a personal loan agreement between myself and my father. Sarah asked for the terms, and I explained that the principal amount was exactly $8,000, but the clauses needed to be incredibly restrictive. I told her the funds must be paid directly to the bank holding his mortgage and the medical collection agency, ensuring not a single cent touched his personal bank account. Furthermore, as collateral for the loan, Richard would have to sign over the deed rights to his personal vehicle to my business entity, so if he missed a single monthly repayment, the vehicle would be legally seized instantly. Sarah paused, noting that it was standard but definitely aggressive for a family loan, and asked if there was anything else. I told her the most important clause was a complete lifestyle and financial audit, requiring Richard to provide my corporate accountant with a full, unredacted monthly bank statement of his household expenses. I specified that if a single dollar was spent on luxury items, sports clubs, or private sports coaching for Leo while the loan was active, the contract would go into immediate default and the full balance would become due within 24 hours. Sarah understood and promised to have it ready for signing by 4 o'clock. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day running my business as usual. But as the clock crept closer to 8 in the evening, a calm, quiet anticipation began to build in my chest. At 7:45, I was sitting in my private office on the top floor of a beautiful, glass-fronted commercial building downtown. The office was a clear reflection of my success, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing city skyline, sleek minimalist furniture, and a massive mahogany desk. My receptionist had already gone home for the evening, so I had left the main security doors unlocked for him. Promptly at 8 o'clock, I heard the heavy glass doors of the main lobby swing open, and hesitant, slow footsteps echoed down the polished concrete hallway, very different from the aggressive, confident stride Richard used to have. The door to my private office knocked gently, and I called out for him to come in, not looking up from my laptop screen immediately. The door pushed open, and Richard stepped inside. He took 3 steps into the room, and then completely stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes went wide as he took in the space, looking at the sweeping views of the city, the expensive tech setup, the corporate branding on the wall, and finally, looking at me. He was completely stunned. He had expected to walk into a tiny, shared cubicle or a rundown apartment. Instead, he was standing in the headquarters of a thriving, highly profitable corporation. He stammered, asking what this place was, and I welcomed him to NexusFlow, explaining that this was my company, which I had built from scratch over the last 3 years. Richard swallowed hard, looking around the room as if trying to wake himself up from a dream, admitting that he never knew and that they thought I was just working some junior tech job. I replied simply that he never asked, pointing out that for 3 years every time he called he talked exclusively about Leo's baseball stats and never once asked how I was paying my rent, what I was building, or if I was even surviving, so I saw no reason to volunteer the information. Richard looked down at his shoes, a heavy, suffocating silence filling the room. The power dynamic had completely shifted in an instant. He wasn't the big, successful father coming to bail out his struggling son. He was a desperate debtor standing in the office of a powerful CEO. I told him to sit down, gesturing to the sleek leather chair directly opposite my desk. He walked over slowly, sitting down on the edge of the seat, as if he were afraid it might break. I told him I had his answer regarding the $8,000, pulling a crisp, white folder out of my desk drawer and sliding it across the polished wood toward him. I told him the money was ready, and that the checks were already written out directly to his bank and the medical collection agency. Richard's face instantly lit up with a wave of profound relief as he thanked me, saying he knew I would come through and that family meant something to me. I told him to stop, my voice dropping an octave and completely cutting off his celebration. I warned him that before he got excited, he needed to open that folder and read the terms, because his salvation came with a very heavy price. Richard's smile instantly withered. His eyes darted nervously from me to the white folder resting under his hand. He slowly flipped it open, his eyes scanning down the legal pages. As he read the clauses, I watched his expression transform from relief to utter shock, and finally, to burning indignation. He stammered, asking what this was, demanding to know why I wanted a vehicle lien and monthly financial audits, shouting that I was treating him like a criminal and demanding his car as collateral. He stood up from the leather chair, his old arrogant temper finally flaring through his exhaustion, yelling that he was my father and asking how I could try to control how they spent their money. I told him I didn't want to control how he spent his money, explaining calmly that I was ensuring my hard-earned capital isn't wasted on the exact same reckless behavior that got him into this disaster in the first place, adding that if he wanted my help, he had to play by my rules. Richard yelled that they were a family, arguing that family doesn't put conditions on love or force their own father to sign a corporate contract just to keep a roof over his head. I slowly stood up from my chair, matching his height. The air in the room became incredibly tense, almost vibrating with years of unspoken resentment and pain. I told him in a deadly, freezing whisper not to talk to me about family, asking where that family energy was when I was working 16 hours a day, starving in a freezing apartment because he refused to help me with a single dollar of college tuition. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I pointed a sharp finger directly at him, silencing him instantly. I demanded to know where that family energy was when he took out massive secondary loans to buy Leo premium sports equipment, while my academic achievements weren't even worth a congratulations at the dinner table. I asked where his family loyalty was when he looked at row 4, section B, saw it empty, and decided that a weekend baseball tournament was more important than his eldest son's college graduation. Richard took a step back, the fury in his eyes suddenly replaced by a profound, trembling fear. He looked at me, and for the very first time in his life, he realized that the quiet, compliant boy he had pushed into the background for 20 years was completely gone. In his place stood a man who held his entire financial survival in the palm of his hand. He whispered my name, admitting that they made mistakes but arguing that they did it all for my brother because they wanted him to have a future. I told him that they sacrificed mine to do it, laying the bitter truth bare between us. I added that the only difference was that I survived their sacrifice, building all of this despite them, not because of them. I made it clear that my life savings wasn't a family pool he got to dip into when his gambles failed, but rather my armor, and told him that if he wanted a piece of it to save his house, he would sign that contract right now. Richard stared at the document on the desk, his hands shaking violently. He looked at the city lights outside, then at the corporate branding, realizing the absolute reality of his situation. He had no other options. The bank was closing in, the collection agencies were relentless, and if he walked out of this office without my help, his entire life would collapse by Friday morning. He slowly sank back down into the leather chair, looking utterly broken, stripped of every ounce of his former pride. He asked quietly if I would stop the foreclosure if he signed it, and I assured him the checks would be sent via overnight courier tonight, satisfying the bank and keeping his house safe. But I reminded him that the moment my accountant saw a single dollar spent on private baseball coaches, country club fees, or luxury items, the contract would default, meaning I would take his car and let the bank take the house, asking if we understood each other. Richard didn't look me in the eye. He reached out a trembling hand, picked up the pen, signed his name on the dotted line, closed the folder, and slid it back to me. He whispered a thank you and stood up from the chair, looking older, like a man who had finally realized the true weight of his life's choices. He turned around and walked slowly toward the office door. Just as his hand touched the door handle, I called out to him, instructing him not to call my personal number anymore, and making it clear that from now on, all communication would go directly through my corporate legal team, before wishing him a safe drive home. Richard's shoulders slumped. He nodded once, a silent gesture of absolute defeat, and walked out into the quiet hallway, leaving me completely alone in the sweeping silence of my office. The signature on that legal contract wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a stone thrown into a quiet pond, creating ripples that completely dismantled the old structure of my family over the next several months. True to my word, the overnight checks cleared his immediate debts by Friday morning. The foreclosure notices were halted, and the heavy shadow of immediate bankruptcy retreated from their doorstep. But the freedom they thought they were buying back came with a level of strict discipline they had never experienced in their lives. My corporate accountant took his job incredibly seriously. On the first of every month, like absolute clockwork, Richard had to submit his unredacted household bank statements to our portal, and every single line item was checked. 2 months into the agreement, I received an escalation email from my accountant flagging an expense of $350 to Apex Velocity baseball training, noting it as a direct violation of the clause regarding unauthorized sports luxury spending and asking for contract default protocols. I stared at the screen, a cold smile touching my lips. Richard just couldn't help himself. Even on the brink of ruin, he was still trying to fund the sports fantasy, still trying to pour money into Leo's broken dream instead of accepting reality. I picked up my office phone and dialed Richard's number directly, the only time I had done so since our meeting. He answered on the second ring, his voice instantly filled with a high-pitched, nervous panic, asking if everything was okay. I told him plainly that he had violated the contract with the baseball training expense. Richard begged me to listen, explaining that Leo was deeply depressed and had been sitting in his room for months doing nothing since the surgery, adding that a scout from a local community college said they might look at him if he could get his throwing form back, pleading that it was only $350. I told him the contract didn't care about hope, but rather about compliance, making it clear that he didn't have the luxury of spending money on baseball training when he was living on my capital. Richard wept openly over the phone, begging me not to default them, saying that if I took the car he couldn't get to work and the whole house would collapse. I let the silence hang on the line for 5 agonizing seconds, letting him fully feel the weight of the cliff he was hanging over, before stating that he had 24 hours to deposit exactly $350 back into his primary account and provide a written cancellation receipt from the training facility, warning him that this was his one and only warning. I hung up the phone without waiting for a response, and he met the deadline, canceling the sessions immediately. That incident completely broke Richard's resistance. He finally realized that I wasn't bluffing and that the old family emotional leverage held absolutely zero power over me. For the next year, their lifestyle underwent a massive, forced correction. Without the endless stream of cash funding his sports identity, Leo had no choice but to face reality. He couldn't spend his days pretending to be a future major league star anymore. He had to get a normal, entry-level job at a local retail store just to help pay for the basic household groceries. For the first time in his life, Leo was experiencing the exact same reality I had lived through. Working hard, dealing with long hours, and operating without a financial savior. My mother, too, had to step up, taking a part-time job at a local school library to bring in extra income, slowly pulling herself out of the passive shadow she had lived in for decades. The family dynamic completely shifted. The loud, arrogant sports talk at the dinner table was entirely replaced by quiet, stressful discussions about budgeting, grocery coupons, and utility bills. They were finally living like normal working-class people, forced to learn the value of a single dollar. I watched all of this from afar, receiving regular analytical updates from my accountant. I didn't feel a sense of cruel joy or malicious glee. What I felt was a profound sense of cosmic balance. The universe was finally correcting the massive asymmetry of my childhood. They were learning the hard way that choices have consequences, and that you cannot build a successful life by exploiting or ignoring the people who love you. A full year passed under the strict terms of our legal agreement. Every single month, the loan repayment of $400 was automatically deposited into my corporate account from Richard's earnings, and every single month, the unredacted bank statements were reviewed, filed, and cleared. They had become perfectly compliant model debtors. One rainy afternoon, I was reviewing the annual financial reports for NexusFlow when I noticed the loan balance from Richard was nearing its halfway point. Out of a strange, sudden impulse, I decided to drive out to my hometown, having not set foot in that neighborhood since the day I packed my bags for college. I pulled up in my sleek, modern SUV, parking a few houses down from my childhood home, watching through the rain-streaked windows. The house looked vastly different. The pristine, perfectly manicured lawn that Richard used to obsess over was a bit overgrown. The expensive luxury sedan that used to sit proudly in the driveway was gone, replaced by a modest, older compact car. The vehicle they had been forced to downsize to maintain their budget under my audit rules. Suddenly, the front door opened, and Leo walked out, dressed in a plain retail worker uniform. He pulled up his hood against the rain, carrying a modest lunchbox, and began walking down the sidewalk toward the local bus stop. There was no private coach waiting for him. There was no premium vehicle picking him up. He was just a normal young guy heading to a hard shift at work. A moment later, Richard stepped onto the porch to grab the mail. He looked incredibly thin, his hair completely gray now, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an old man who had spent the year carrying a heavy sack of concrete on his shoulders. As I watched him stand there in the gray rain, a profound realization washed over me. I didn't hate him anymore. The burning, icy anger that had fueled my late-night coding sessions for years, the bitter resentment that had defined my young adult life, it had completely evaporated. Looking at him now, he didn't look like a powerful, terrifying villain who had destroyed my childhood. He just looked like a small, flawed, short-sighted man who had made a series of terrible bets in life and lost everything. My success hadn't been stopped by his neglect. It had been forged by it. By leaving me to fend for myself, he had inadvertently given me the tools to become completely unbreakable. It was just tying me to a past I had completely outgrown. The next morning, I walked into my office and called my accountant into the room, instructing him to draw up a final loan closure agreement for Richard. He looked surprised, noting that they still owed over $4,000 on the principal balance and hadn't defaulted. I told him I knew, sliding a personal check across the desk to cover the remaining balance in full from my personal accounts. I instructed him to send Richard a formal notice stating that the loan had been paid in full, the vehicle lien was fully dissolved, and the monthly financial audits were officially concluded, effective immediately. He took the check and promised to process the release paperwork today. As he reached the door, I added that he should block their access to our corporate portal, noting that the file was officially closed. 2 days later, I received a final text message on my personal phone from Richard. The message read that they had received the legal release paperwork today, and although he didn't know why I did it, he thanked me for saving their house and showing them the truth, adding that he was deeply sorry for everything and hoped that one day I could forgive him. I stared at the screen for a long moment. I didn't type a response. I didn't need to. The apology was accepted in the quiet spaces of my own heart, but the relationship was entirely over. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt after they burn. They are meant to be left behind so you can cross new rivers. I locked my phone, slid it into my pocket, and walked out of my office to join my team for a celebration lunch. As Nexus Flow had just crossed a massive milestone and the future was looking brighter than the noon sun. Every story has an ending, but the true value of a story is the lesson it leaves behind in the quiet moments after the noise has died down. Looking back on everything that happened, from that cold, heartbreaking afternoon in row 4 of the university auditorium to the high-stakes confrontation in my glass corporate office, I realized that revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It isn't about watching them burn or laughing at their misery. True revenge is completely outgrowing the people who thought they could break you. If I had spent my life drowning in bitterness, crying over the unfairness of my childhood, and begging Richard for his love, I would have remained trapped in his script forever. I would have been the permanent victim, defined entirely by their neglect. Instead, I took that deep, agonizing pain and used it as raw architectural material. I built a fortress of personal success, emotional security, and financial freedom out of the very bricks they threw at me. When they came knocking on my door, desperate for a savior, I didn't respond with emotional tantrums or blind rage. I responded with cold, clinical justice. I forced them to face the exact same reality they had condemned me to live in for decades. And in doing so, something beautiful happened. The punishment didn't just protect my capital. It actually forced them to grow. It forced my brother Leo to discover the dignity of hard, honest work. It forced my father Richard to shed his destructive pride and learn the humility of accountability. By refusing to play the role of the easy, compliant savior, I broke the cycle of generational dysfunction that had plagued our family for years. I still have that leather-bound college diploma sitting on the shelf in my living room. Sometimes, when I walk past it, I stop and look at it. I don't see the empty seats in row 4 anymore. I don't feel that heavy, freezing weight of isolation. I see a milestone. I see the exact coordinates where a boy realized he was completely on his own and decided that was more than enough to conquer the world. To anyone out there who is currently sitting in their own version of an empty auditorium, watching the people who were supposed to support them walk away in the opposite direction, do not lose hope. Do not let their blindness convince you that you are invisible. Their inability to see your worth has absolutely nothing to do with your value, and everything to do with their own limitations. Take the pain. Take the rejection. Take the cold, quiet anger. Bury it deep inside your spirit, let it fuel your late-night grind, and build a life that is completely, undeniably magnificent. Work until your success becomes so loud that the people who ignored you have no choice but to listen. And when your day finally comes, when the tables turn and the scales of justice balance out, remember to lead with your head, not just your heart. Set your boundaries high, protect your hard-earned security with absolute ferocity, and never, ever feel guilty for walking away from a table where love was never served. Because at the end of the day, the ultimate success isn't just about the numbers in your bank account or the view from your office window. It's about looking in the mirror and knowing that when the world left you in the dark, you dug deep down into your soul, found your own match, and lit up the entire sky yourself.